in this party that can't decide who the fuck they want to represent.
Yes, folks. How's it going, Matt? How are you doing, brother?
Doing good, David. Good to be with you. Let's try to. There we go. Short and sweet there from Sean Fain, saying the reason they lost to Trump is because Democrats don't know who the fuck they want to represent. And I think that's actually putting it kind, because I think they know who they want to represent. I just don't think that's enough people to turn out on election day.
No matter how much money you spend. Folks, this is a jam-packed episode. I'm really excited to be getting to our guests today. We're covering it all. We're covering the Biden administration, the fight against Trump, Ukraine and Russia. I mean, what more could you ask for?
Yeah, really. And going back into Left Reckoning lore, I remember one of the favorite videos, because I called Jimmy Dore a drunk asshole, was him going after our guest Elise and several other young female activists. And in a way that he went after Greta Thunberg for not going after the United States military, and she only spent the next year basically pissing off all of Europe, criticizing Israel's genocide in Gaza. So a bad call there, but good call by us, and it's nice to have Elise on. And also Van Jackson, who's show you should subscribe to on YouTube if you're watching this on YouTube right now. Undiplomatic, undiplomatic, really smart show, massively underrated.
No, I mean, totally. And, we didn't get a chance to talk with Elise about this, but one day I'd like to do an episode on this kind of like crank politics, which, basically the theory of these guys is that everybody in politics is getting paid by someone, which I think is a bad way to kind of think about at least fights on the left, right? Like a lot of those kind of things are like way more clear than some of these conspiracy theorists like want to get into about why people do the things that they do if you disagree with them.
100%.
I mean, there was a weird one about like, AOC, who I'm not even a big defender. There was another weird one of those floating around. I even saw leftists sharing this idea that, that AOC is getting paid by all these folks. It's like, look, sometimes people make bad political decisions, and it's not just because they're getting a check.
And sometimes the people are inclined towards politics, end up interacting with things. But yeah, I think that is and look, far be it for me to say I just had Jefferson Morley on talking about the JFK assassination, but you're absolutely right that like it is a pathological way of dealing with the world.
Well,
honestly,
I mean, you remember when everybody was a paid protester? That was a couple years ago, right? And it's like, maybe the dream is that like everyone just shows up as at a protest, protesters and counter protest, and then at the end we all sort of get together and spend our checks at a bar. But I don't know. It's just a deranged way to view things, and I think, unfortunately, a decent amount of people on like the quote unquote left, let's say, fall into that trap. But we got to get back to the old me. We got to talk a little bit about Bernie Sanders and this oligarchy, a fight oligarchy tour, Matt. I mean, we have some clips and things we want to get to in a second. I'll just say that it is extremely frustrating when you realize just how clearly correct Bernie has been about what needs to happen politically in this country, right? I mean, like, it is unbelievable. I mean, we were saying beforehand, there's all those kind of Hillary Clinton, she was right memes. I mean, no, she absolutely was not. But Bernie Sanders.
They're doing that for Kamala too. Like, as she signs with Creative Arts Agency, she warned us of Project 2025. It's like she didn't do a lot. She toured with Liz Cheney talking about democracy. All right, like that wasn't a warning for anybody.
No, totally. And I mean, I think that this sort of gets down to the fundamental issues that, a lot of people in politics, in the Democratic Party do want to have these kind of media careers because they're, at the end of the day, they just want to be on TV. They just want to be influencers. Bernie Sanders is somebody who is very good at public speaking and is very good on camera, but you can imagine that he's not somebody who's wanting to take a bunch of takes when he's doing these videos here, and we have a couple of them to get to. But it's undeniable that there's a real hunger in this country for there to be some action. I mean, I've just been talking to family members in the past few weeks, and people are very scared about what's going on with this oligarch Elon Musk and his buddy Donald Trump, the gutting of government, the war on workers, but also the war on the future. And then the realization that, particularly for people who might not be enmeshed in politics in the same way that we are, this kind of feeling that's like, oh shit, it doesn't even seem like there's a real opposition to it, right? People are looking for marching orders. People are looking for ways to get involved. People are looking for ways to fight back. And the Democratic Party basically has decided that they want to sit on their hands for 2 years, let things get as bad as possible, and hopefully use that to fundraise off of and be able to sleepwalk into a midterm victory.
James Carville literally said, roll over and play dead until the Republicans exhaust themselves. This is again, this is something that I've been saying for a long time, is that they envy Keir Starmer so much. They don't give a crap about all the damage inflicted under Boris Johnson and the myriad other Tories who were prime minister, as they waited for them to blow their own party's credibility enough for Labour just to win an election by default. That's the only way these people want to win.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Because they are allergic to politics, right? Because politics actually means engaging with everyday people, which, by the way, is something that Bernie Sanders is really good at. So we're going to talk a little bit about this Fight Oligarchy tour. Bernie Sanders has held these packed rallies. I don't know if you've seen the videos, watch the videos closely, Matt. But just some of the photographs that Bernie has shared. I'll share these via Twitter with folks. I mean, packed crowds. They ended up having to have overflow events because so many people were showing up to these. I mean, these are the kind of things that other politicians, right? Also, remember, this isn't even election time, right? This is just people showing up to an event like this because they want to hear about what can be done. But they had these overflow events. Usually in election season, politicians will pay volunteers to show up to kind of fill out a room. And these are the Bernie Sanders people are filling up rooms. Again, not even at election time, because people are really, really hungry for answers and something that because people are asking the question, what is it that we can do to push back against this? And we have some of the Bernie Sanders things in a moment that we can get to, but it's abundantly clear that people are looking for answers, are looking for direction, and all of us who are engaged politically, are members of political organizations, should be taking this as a moment that we're getting very serious about how can we expand our movement and how can we reach people. And frankly, other than a few other folks who we might talk about later in the program on the political level, on the national political level, almost nobody in the Democratic Party is interested in that growing part of politics right
now. 100%. Yeah. I mean, there's a few, but it's wild the way Hakeem Jeffries is still saying, look, people are mad at me because I stood up to the left as much as I stood up to the right.
Yeah.
You just got back from Northern California talking to Silicon Valley people. The DCCC, the Democratic Campaign Cash Committee, that's not the real acronym, just got millions of dollars from SpaceX and Palantir fundraisers. And people see it. It's wild the extent that these Democrats don't understand that everyone sees you. And like you said, they're expecting a fight back. And the thing is they're not cut out to do it. You listen to Hakeem Jeffries talk, and it's very clear that what he's good at is talking to rich people and not offending them. And that's pretty much it.
That's the skill of of being a member of the Democratic Party at this point, especially at least being in leadership, right? Now, I want to get to the message of Bernie Sanders, what Bernie Sanders has been doing. Also, let's also not forget that in addition to these rallies, he's also being exceptionally successful on social media, reaching millions upon millions of people with his message and analysis of what's going on. But let's get to some of the detractors, because I think these are actually really important points about why Democrats continue to lose, why Democrats are not just not winning elections, but are losing voters, particularly voters, working class voters, voters of color, the people who ostensibly they're supposed to be representing. Ostensibly, it's supposed to be, that's supposed to be the party for those people. They're now going to the right. And a big part of it, there's a lot of factors, right? Including the devastation of NAFTA, the betrayal of Obama, the destruction of the workers' protections and the victories of the labor movement that has been, led by the Democratic Party in many ways. But a big part of this is just fundamental condescension. And this one, I can pull it up, Matt, if you'd like. This tweet here from Jamel Hill, I hope folks will know. Not trying to be funny, but this isn't a good title for the tour. A lot of the people you're trying to reach don't know what oligarchy means, and certainly not within the context of their everyday life. And this is obviously in response to Bernie Sanders' Fighting Oligarchy tour. Matt, do you have a reaction here?
Well, first of all, I will just remind folks that I was always saying Donald Trump calling Ron DeSantis sanctimonious was a good call because people like words. People like to be armed with knowledge. And this, I can't believe that condescension. I can't believe that Jamel Hill went to Michigan State because it seems like that's an Ivy League perspective. I think the best response I saw was this here, Charles Preston. Posted this clip of Kwame Ture, and it is so gratifying to see a sentiment that, frankly, I've felt so much in my lifetime because like one thing I do have I have a good vocabulary in terms of like test taking and stuff like that. But look, folks, back when Kwame Ture said this, you had to go to a library, and now you can just look this stuff up on your phone, and so there's even less of an excuse. But here's a Kwame Ture asking or getting a sort of relevant question.
Could you give people just a quick background on who that is?
Kwame Ture, originally Stokely Carmichael, big in sort of Black liberation struggles in sort of Black Panther era and that sort of thing. Here is this.
Like, I was born and raised on a farm, and like I can't use all these philosophical words, so forth and so on, and I'm not, well, I went a year and a half of junior college, but I didn't get a degree.
As a brother born on a farm, if I use words which you don't understand, please, let me tell you that what you should do is to write those words down and go study them and know them as well as I know them. Because there's nothing I can do that you can't do. And you must never let anybody whoop you with any knowledge, because it belongs to everybody. And as your brother, I urge you and encourage you to learn these words and to understand them, to know capitalism, to know communism, and to know socialism. I urge you to know them for yourself, not to take my word for it or anybody else's word for it, because they're forces that are fighting in the world.
Now, that is what genuine empowerment is, coming from a lecture stage. And like you said, like there is an appetite for this. Everyone likes to talk about how stupid the people are. The people want this stuff, but we put it behind student loan debt and that sort of thing. Why do you think Jordan Peterson is so popular? Because he posts his gibberish, which frankly that it is, about all Bible stories and Frozen on YouTube, accessible for people for free, and they gobbled it up. And there's like we go back to like when Oscar Wilde was in America touring the country, miners were coming to see him in Colorado. Like people love this stuff, and it like you cannot it is toxic, it is poison to have people who supposedly orient political leaders to say actually people are stupid, dumb it down for them. And you know what? That's not really the reason. The reason is rich people don't like people talking about oligarchs. And Jamel Hill has internalized what rich people want. Right?
Well, and I want to get back to her in a second, but this is a fundamental point about being a socialist here, right? As you're saying, that clip is phenomenal. I did a video a few years back for Jacobin called "Political Education is for Everyone," and I looked at a lot of those at examples, like from for example, like somebody like Fred Hampton, right, who is very militant about people being educated, right? There's a video of somebody in the party. Providing him with a model for a publicly controlled bank, right? And Fred Hampton just goes in on these guys because there's no education section in the proposal, right? And he's like, we need people to understand why it is that we're doing this. One, so that we don't create something that then people in the future destroy, right? But two, fundamentally, because these are democratic powers. If you are ever in a political organization or a socialist organization where the leadership says, you don't need to understand the theory, you don't need to understand the history, you need to get out of that organization, because that is a top-down cult. And this is something that has plagued political movements, not just on the left, but certainly on the left, for a really long time, where a small cadre of people say, oh, we're the only ones who can understand theory and history and praxis. So just take marching orders from us.
I mean, the entire field of economics, basically, in our lifetimes has been that bluff of, actually, it's too complicated. You don't understand supply and demand. And that's why the government just needs to impoverish you even more than you already are.
And this is a fundamental debate too, Matt, as I'm sure you know, having done this for a really long time, where people will say like, "Oh, well, so and so folks, won't be able to understand this," or blah blah blah. People don't want to engage with this kind of stuff. Look, when you're talking to people and recruiting them to their movement, there's just like basic ways to communicate with folks. And walking up to somebody and handing them a big ass book and saying, "You must read this before I will speak to you," that's probably not going to be an effective way to engage folks. But these kind of ideas that we're going to have like a secret language for certain groups of people in our movement, right? Also, a big problem on the left is that there's a lot of college educated people who might want to gatekeep information from other folks. So we're not going to do kind of general political education in our organization. It is wrong. And the fact of the matter is, as you were showing there, and if people read my work in Jacobin, maybe the book that I'm writing that'll be coming out soonish, you will see that throughout the American socialist movement, political education has not only been a large part of it, it has been a motivating and mobilizing force for people to engage in politics. Because not only, look, I think sometimes on our side, and I fall into this trap too, that sometimes socialists can be a little crass in our approach to what it is that is appealing about our ideas about the world, right? We'll say like, hey, we're for higher wages, we're for, universal healthcare, all these kind of things, which will improve people's lives. And that is absolutely true. And that's something that we should stick to and continuing hammering home. But in addition to all these other kind of things, what being a socialist and being a Marxist gives to people is a way to understand the world around them, to a way to understand history. So instead of just sort of being bombarded with bad news stories and confusing events, actually, I have a structure to see and view and understand events. I can understand somebody like Elon Musk years before anyone else did. Remember, for years, a lot of people, it was the socialists who said, hey, this guy is anti-democratic, is somebody who is going to try to wage war on society just because he's a billionaire, right? We didn't have to know all of his history and what he's into and his online behavior. It is because fundamentally being a billionaire, being an oligarch, is somebody who has an anti-democratic impulse because it is to their benefit to have the rest of the country and the rest of the people weak, right? People want answers to the big questions in their life. And the fact that so many leftists for so long in our movement have sort of refused to step into that role is exceptionally dangerous, right? And like people like Jamel Hill who are going to say that kind of thing, we kind of, the writing's on the wall. We get their politics here. But you hear this on the left too, and I'm sure we'll get comments in here as well, continuing to push this insulting idea. Look, I'm the first one in my family to go to school, right? I'm like a working class kid. My family did, all that kind of stuff. I wanted to learn about things when I was young. That's why I learned about socialism. That's how I got engaged in a lot of these kind of things, because I had questions about the world that weren't being answered in school. And thank God, the first people I spoke to when I had these kind of questions directed me in this way, instead of saying like, "Oh, you know what? You're not the right kind of person to pick up these texts here."
Yeah, it is really like the science of socialism is really the chicken soup the American soul needs, and it is kept from them. And instead, we get all of this bullshit from both sides of the aisle about like basically um, financial parasitical like desires about like everyone can be an entrepreneur and start their own business, or even like trade crypto and secure your financial future. Oh, crypto can help the unbanked. Oh, Democrats will tell you even disproportionately Black people are invested in crypto. It's like, well, that's bad, right? Like why? Like, and we get all of this bullshit about like how to actually make it from a political class that is literally keeping essentials from people. Like we went through a pandemic where instead of extending what everyone knew should happen, which is public health insurance to people, which is the easiest way to stop the ban, we went through a system called Cobra, which is way more expensive, but you didn't want to create any sense of entitlement. And it's like, it's no wonder. It's almost a shock that America and the world is better, is well adjusted as it is, when this is the messages that we get, and the real meaning of life, which is class struggle, frankly, on a broad sense, on a community level, is basically muted from the airwaves.
Yeah, and look, we got some more things we got to get to in the segment before we get to our interview. So we'll maybe have to come back to this larger question of political education. Last thing I'll say is this: this is literally like our history, right? All across like the South is like the history I know better. But working class people were being crushed by the merchant class and crushed by the banks and crushed by the government. And what they did is they got together and they started saying, I wonder what it is that is affecting my life. And people started reading like economics and history and all of these new ideas coming from Europe. They started doing the work of educating people who weren't able to read. This was the political work of all of these radical, progressive, and populist movements across the South and, certainly across the rest of the country. And they paid dividends. You had 50, 60 years of militancy all across the South that ends up it was so strong and so dangerous to the ruling class, they have to crush it in one of the most extreme acts of anti-democracy in our history, right? So this isn't just like some kind of like theory of like, I imagine if everybody got together and read these. When our ancestors did this, they won the 8-hour working day. They won labor protections. They won the direct election of senators. They won, victory after victory because they were educating each other and engaging in that kind of class politics. I apologize. We have to get to this other stuff, but don't ever let anyone say that this isn't part of the American tradition here. But here's the thing, going back to the Jamel Hill thing, is that she's just wrong as a strategist here, as Craig Phelps notes. Bernie Sanders' Iowa City is the most searched term in Iowa over the past 48 hours. In the past 7 days, people in Nebraska, Alaska, and Wyoming round out the top 5 regions searching oligarchy. Yeah, it was a massive success as we just looked at the crowd numbers. The fact that people are engaging with this kind of thing is just undeniable. So had Bernie Sanders taken this bad advice, we would be worse off for it. And look, as we were saying earlier, Matt, like people like to learn. I have this clip of Bernie explaining oligarchy too, because it also just takes a couple seconds to help folks out here. Unless you had anything you want to add first.
No, that's great. I mean, I love that detail that it's the most searched thing. Because I remember when Obama came to North Dakota in 2008. Some of these national politicians are leaving a lot on the table, not showing up to these communities that aren't sort of even thought of during the actual campaign season.
Totally. We have 2 Bernie clips here. Let's play the shorter one of him explaining oligarchy to folks, because again, like people like to be in class and learn some things, and Bernie does a pretty damn good job.
I do not often find myself in the habit of thanking Elon Musk, but I must confess that he has done an exceptional job of demonstrating a point that a few of us have been making for years, and that is the reality that we live in an oligarchic society in which billionaires dominate not only our politics and the information we consume from media, but our government and economic lives as well.
Now, hold on to this thread because we'll get to the second half of this video in a second. But yeah, Matt, I mean, I think pretty easy to follow. And actually, man, that seems like a word if I was unfamiliar with it, right? Or it seemed like an archaic word somewhere that you use for another country. Man, I feel like, one, I have another arrow in the quiver. And also, man, that actually is kind of worrying that like my economic life and my government life and the media all do seem to be controlled by a certain group of people who have particular interests.
Yeah, and Bernie, of course, was saying this all throughout the Biden administration. I want to point out, like, Trump is. I just want to play this Trump thing real quick here, because he also knows that people understand what oligarchy is and what an opportunity this is for Bernie to basically be the only one capturing what is a lot of political energy right now. Here is Trump. This is his position on oligarchs. Oh, and just to preface this. Sorry, Trump has a new thing called gold cards, which is if you are a rich foreigner, you can buy citizenship for $5 million. So he's gonna, and so apparently he's asked here if Russians can get in on it.
Russian oligarch be eligible for a gold card?
Yeah, possibly. Hey, I know some Russian oligarchs that are very nice people. It's possible. They're not quite as wealthy as they used to be. They're not as wealthy as they used to be. I think they can afford. I think they can afford $5 million. No, a lot of people are going to want to. A lot of people are going to want to be in this country, and they'll be able to work and provide jobs and build companies and pay taxes. All of those things.
So yeah, it's basically asking the oligarchs to come home.
Yeah. Hey, if you like a system of government where money gets you access and power, wherever you're from, you can do that here too. Just pay the Trump tax. I mean, truly, that is one of the nice things about Trump is that he does kind of expose these fundamental realities of American society pretty clearly.
Yep.
Now, all right. Well, let's get to this last bit of the burn-in. I know, unlike Bernie, this was not short and sweet, but I think we needed to get to a lot of these things. We have this Bernie clip. We'll play a couple minutes of it because, again, talking about putting things very clearly to people, these are messages that millions of people are engaging with, and it is wild to see basically like the general media silence on what's happening, what it might mean politically, what it means about America, that this is what people are engaging with. But let's play this here because I think Bernie Sanders, and for folks who know their social history, it's very clear who Bernie Sanders is kind of emulating here with this rhetoric. But let's just hear Bernie Sanders talk a little bit about the problems
in both major political parties. Bottom line, the oligarchs with their enormous resources are waging a war against the working class of this country, and it is a war that they are intent on winning. Now, I'm not going to kid you. The problems this country faces right now are extremely serious. The economy is rigged. Our campaign finance system is corrupt, and we are struggling to control climate change, an existential threat to our planet, among many, many other important issues. But this is what I do know. The worst fear that the ruling class in this country has is that Americans, black, white, Latino, urban and rural, gay and straight, young and old, that all of us will come together to demand a government that represents all of the people in our country, not just the wealthy few. The oligarch's nightmare is that we will not allow ourselves to be divided up by race, religion, sexual orientation, or country of origin, and will together have the courage to take them on. Will this struggle be easy? Absolutely not. And one of the reasons for that is that the ruling class of this country will constantly remind you that they have all the power. They control the government, they own the media. You want to take us on? Good luck, they will say. There is nothing you can do about it. But our job right now, in these very difficult times, is to not forget the great struggles and sacrifices that millions of people have waged over the several centuries to create a more democratic, just, and humane society. Think about it. Over the last number of centuries, how many people have stood up and fought? And when they were doing that, you know what their contemporaries said? They said, hey, you want to overthrow the King of England to create a new nation and self-rule? Forget about it. Impossible. You want to establish universal suffrage, the right of all people to vote? Impossible. Can't happen. You want to end slavery and segregation? Impossible. You want to grant workers the right to form unions and end child labor? Can't be done. Impossible. You want to give women control over their own bodies? Who are you kidding? Impossible. Can't be done. You want to pass?
Yeah, I mean,
there's a reason that he is doing overflow crowds in places like Iowa, and people like this are posting just shit on online, not doing nothing. I have lots of criticisms of Bernie over the past year, over the past year and a half, especially in November, saying how can you reach a ceasefire with a group like Hamas? That's very bad. Bernie is a politician, and when it comes to politicians, he's not been transcended by anyone. He is what he's doing here with this oligarchic focus is to name an enemy that isn't immigrants or trans people or whoever the fuck. It's the actual enemy. And that's the most important work that can be done in this moment right now. And we all owe Bernie a lot of thanks for that.
I think that's well said, Matt. I'll just add, one of the things that the opponents from the Democratic Party will never understand about Bernie Sanders and why he had so much appeal when he ran for president, why he continues to fill out crowds like that, is because of what he says in that clip that we just played, where he noted that what the billionaires are afraid of, what the oligarchs are afraid of, is people recognizing that they have the power. Right. And that kind of self-actualization, right, recognition of the power that working class people have, right, and that's latent in society, is the kind of mobilizing and motivating aspect of Bernie Sanders politics that you'll never get from any of these other folks, right? Because they don't want you to have the power. They don't think that you have the capacity to rule. They don't think that you have the capacity to govern. They think that you should be ruled, that you should be controlled, and that you should be managed, right? And this is something that is just fundamentally different about Bernie Sanders' appeal. And I always get so mad when people try to compare like Trump and Bernie, because Trump doesn't do this either. Trump says, I'm going to save you, support me, and like my guys will get in there and we'll fix all the problems. Well, Bernie Sanders is very clear about all of us, right? Not me, us, as everybody knows. Now, since we got to wind it up, we can't go into all these different threads. I will just say, as you were saying, Matt, this is where I will, have to change from going back to the old me with the Bernie stuff, is that it's great to see these kind of messages. They're resonating with people. It shows that there's a lot of energy. Bernie, you got it. We got to do it. Like, we got to do it at this point. I mean, we have to create the organization and structure for people to go to. It has to happen. It can't be another messaging moment, inspirational moment. As important and great as this is, I'm supporting it. I think we should do it, but I also think we have to create the structure for this working class movement that you've been talking about for so long to exist, right? And you don't even have to lead it or anything, but we got to start it, and you need to start directing people into it, or else we will be in a constant cycle of this, and it will be unfortunate way to frankly waste a moment where so many people are ready to engage in politics and fight for a better world. If we do not create a working class movement, and that means like an organization with a structure that is able to play politics on the national level and on the local level in elections, and also on the labor front, right? All aspects of society, there has to be this kind of organization and movement. And Bernie Sanders, as the one person who has been able to keep the torch of American socialism, that tradition going back to Debs, alive, right? It has to happen, right? It really does. And, I don't want people to think that like I'm just sort of, starry-eyed about all these things that I'm saying, because I'm not. But I'm saying like there's a chance for it again. It has to be built, and like there's no better time than right now when a lot of people are turning their back on the failed project of the Democratic Party and their leadership that has given us Trump now twice.
It's going to be interesting to see how this, because the 2028 Sean Fain and the other labor unions, they have to be involved in that. And also, like, I mean, DSA, like, who can he pass the ball to, I guess, is the ultimate thing. Because I frankly, I think Bernie, if I had to guess based on this trajectory, he's going to try to put this energy back into primary and Democrats. And what structure that's under, I mean, that's, I guess, a question for the next year.
Yeah, I mean, these are the big questions in the moment. But We'll have plenty of time to talk about that on this program and many, many others. Folks, you can support us at patreon.com/leftreckoning to get the bonus episodes every Sunday. We talked a really great game with Jody Dean about the feudalism, the neo-feudalism thesis, and the debate around that. I have my opinions on it. It was really great having the conversation with Jody. Her book's really interesting. You get that as a patron. We got much, much more. And immediately after these interviews that we're about to share with y'all that are really, really good, I'm really excited to share these with y'all. Matt and I are going to go over the post game. We'll be taking questions from y'all. So if anybody has any ideas about what we were just saying, we'd love to hear it over in the post game at patreon.com/leftreckoning. But Matt, what are we putting these up? Because these are two really, really great conversations with two people I've been wanting to have on the program for a long time, and I'm happy to be able to do them both at the same time. Matt, you are speaking to the wind. You got to.
Elise Joshi is going to be first here. Gen Z for Change, talking about her sort of trajectory over those things and the disillusionment with the Democratic Party. Here's Elise. Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, friend.
And happy to be joined today by Elise Joshi. Elise is a young activist on labor and climate and also walkable cities. Elise, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Excited.
We're excited to have you. This is actually not the first time you have appeared on our show, though the previous time was in a sort of famous protest that you did. But before we get to that, introduce yourself for folks and what you've been up to.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Elise. I'm born and raised in the Bay Area, haven't left. I am a climate and labor organizer, and I just was executive director of a nonprofit called Gen Z for Change. I'm on the board now, but as of a week and a half ago, I have stepped down from that position. And yeah, that's the gist.
I think Elise's work at Gen Z for Change, first to spoiler for people, she appeared in when we talked about her interrupting Carrie Jean-Pierre re climate action, and we covered it not just how brave your protest was, but also Jimmy Dore smearing you as a corporate plant. I want to say, I think you and a few other Gen Z for Change people really did a great job in, I think, a pretty horrible political environment over these past 4 years. But I'm just curious what your response would be to that sort of thing.
Thanks. When you emailed me saying that happened, that was actually the first time I heard about it. So I was getting thousands of hate comments from right-wing Twitter people, and I did notice that there was this conspiracy theory that I was a plant of the Democratic Party. But that's when I deleted my Twitter and my TikTok, and I needed to take a break. So I actually didn't see how big the thread got. So I don't have too much to share, but it is pretty wild. The protest against a Democratic president could result in that.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty heinous by people who are pretty cynical. And I mean, that they had that sort of effect on you as a young activist, despite, like you said, standing up to the Biden administration. Just give us your sort of history of trying to push the Biden administration on these issues.
Yeah, I mean, it helps to give some context of I've evolved over the years, and my politics has evolved. I've learned lessons in working with the Democratic Party. I started organizing really when COVID happened, and I didn't get a high school graduation. As a result of COVID, my first semester of college was all online, and I started reading a lot about the climate crisis and climate policy through, baby leftist books like Naomi Klein, On Fire, and other books as well. And I realized that TikTok was an engine that a lot of people were using to educate others online, especially young people. And when the 2020 wildfires hit my area, and I was feeling 300 plus AQI from wildfire smoke, COVID, Trump was denying the reality of both crises. And I was like, okay, I gotta get on TikTok and talk to more young people and not feel as crazy. And that's when I gained an audience by my 10th video. And I started learning how to communicate online, trial and error, and I was introduced to not an organization, this like organic group called TikTok for Biden, which was a coalition of creators on TikTok that were trying to get Trump out of office. And there was political creators like myself that were connecting Trump to the climate crisis, but there was also, fashion creators, lifestyle creators, humor creators that were all part of this coalition. And it, wasn't a nonprofit or anything. And after the election, that became Gen Z for Change. And it was this very, amorphous group when I joined it. No money, no structure. I had no title, and we were just trying to figure out who we are beyond electoral politics. And the founder, Aidan Cohn Murphy, believed in holding Democrats accountable to the thing we organized young people to vote for, like no more drilling on public lands, like galvanizing the public sector to combat the climate crisis, and other good things that we wanted to happen, and with a trifecta of Democrats. And through Gen Z for Change and through my own work, I was excited to push for these policies. When the IRA passed, I was invited by the White House to come and celebrate the passage of a climate bill. So, that was the context of how I was, related to the Democratic Party, to the Biden administration. They noted that this group, TikTok for Biden, helped them win. And so, hey, let's give you an invite to this, event. And I went to Hispanic Heritage Month at the White House. I think those were the 2 times I went. Maybe there was a third. But, I wasn't strategizing with them at all. They were just giving us these events to make us feel good. It was wild. Like, you can go back to my TikTok. During the time that I was going to the White House to celebrate the IRA, I was criticizing the IRA on my page and getting 100,000, 200,000 views on those videos. So it was a really interesting dynamic. And I didn't feel like I was watering myself down by getting these opportunities because I knew what I was posting. And so anyways, all this to say is, leading up to the moment I'm interrupting Karine, was 2023, I was posting a lot about fossil fuel phase out because I was the first person on TikTok to post the video asking Biden to not approve the Willow Project, which was the largest proposed oil drilling project on public lands. And this was in the North Slope of Alaska. And what eventually that led to was 1.1 million letters sent to the White House to stop this project. It got 400 million plus views in a matter of a couple of weeks on TikTok to stop the Willow Project. The only other things that were viral on TikTok during this time was Hailey Bieber and Selena Gomez's beef with each other. So this was on par with pop culture. And so it was really exciting, and he approved it. And I think it was the aftermath of the approval that they realized, oh my God, we don't understand TikTok, and we don't understand how big this is going to impact our relation with young people. A poll came out by Data for Progress that was 18 to 29-year-old support for Biden's climate and environmental policy dropped 13% right after Willow, from 48 to 35% approval. So it was having an impact. And what I told the White House through, the people that were sending me invites was, your first impression on climate was not the IRA, it was the Willow Project. And you're going to have to make 7 to 8 good impressions to make up for a bad impression, because that's how it works. Your first impression is how you perceive that group or person now. And so, come on. And it was a weird time. They were giving me access for the first time to actual strategy conversations. I was meeting with several agencies, Department of Interior, Department of Council of Environmental Quality, the Office of Public Engagement. And in all these meetings, I was adamant that we needed to reject new projects, to have a managed decline of current existing projects, and meet the campaign promises. And they would either scoff at me, they would either say, nice things of we hear you, but, and I was I'm not being taken seriously. They think I'm going to accept a conversation with a higher up Democrat or Biden appointee and be happy with the access and go on my merry way. And I just was seeing no progress from this access at all. And so this long story, apologies, is that this leads up to, in DC, I'm making content with Jamal Bowman, with Summer Lee, about the need to declare a climate emergency, trying to still galvanize young people on a fossil fuel phase out even after the Willow Project's approval. And then I was invited to this youth conference where, you know, people like Jamal Bowman were speaking at, but also people like Nancy Pelosi and Karine Jean-Pierre were at. And I had no idea that I was going to be so close to people within the administration. And I joined this event. There's no security. And that's why people think that it's a conspiracy theory of like, oh, I would have been thrown out, or like some police officer would have like tackled me. This was run by like 19-year-olds that did not understand that there were higher up people in the administration here and maybe security would be needed. And so that hole on their end, I took advantage of. I was thinking, you know, dang, Karina's here. Like, maybe I should say something. A lot of the team members at Gen Z for Change were there. And I was like, how do you think this would look as a reputation of Gen Z for Change? I don't know how big this would get. And they said, we trust you. Like, do what you think is best. You're our leader and we trust you. And it meant so much to me in that moment. And I just wrote like a couple notes on my notes app of like some pointers that I'd want to say. I wasn't sure I was going to do it. Some other people were thinking about it because the Sunrise Movement was there, and nobody was doing it. So I was like, is it going to be me? Are people expecting me to do this? And she ended up not coming on at the end. I thought I'd have like maybe 30 minutes to think about it. She ends up coming on in the middle, and she starts talking about climate change. And she talks about how she's like, the Biden administration cares about young people. And I was like, yeah, no, I'm standing up. And you can see how much anxiety I felt in that moment. It was not easy for me. It was not planned. Karine Jean-Pierre definitely didn't know about it, like these GOP people think. But yeah, that's the story. That was the buildup. There was so much organizing and disappointment that went behind that. It was more than just like a girl that cares about climate interrupting it. In a way, the Republican these like right wingers were somewhat right in that they might have been familiar with me, and they were catering to me in some way, and I didn't care for the nice words and the lack of action, and that's really what led to that moment. And yeah, that's what happened.
I think it's honestly a really inspiring, and especially that you had your team there with you, the other people at Gen Z for Change, and sort of strategizing that moment, because you were there because of the genuine work and care you have for these issues like climate change. And the Democrats, like, one thing is they can't simulate that entirely. So when you do all this organizing on TikTok, they need to find a way to bring it in somehow. But I think it was always clear, at least to me, that you guys had the right sort of idea for something that's a very difficult job, which is getting a capitalist party to take meaningful action on climate change. But yeah, I mean, talk more about like the morale within your, because that was a viral video.
Oh, I mean, the morale afterwards, you mean?
Yeah, with Gen Z for Change, or at least some of the feedback you got, whatever.
Yeah, so it went more viral than I could have possibly imagined. I don't know. It was a lot of resentment from young people. I think that they resonated in that moment. I think what I was getting DMs from as well, from young girls as well, the nerves that you could visibly see from me in the video too, meant something to people. Like, hey, you clearly were nervous and you still did it, and that's inspiring too. I think that might have played a role in why it did well. There was a few months after that I just stopped reading comments, and I wasn't on TikTok nearly as much. I could have maybe taken advantage of the moment and posted a lot more, but it got pretty bad for me, for my mental health, to be on social media very often, from right wingers, but also Democrats that were telling me that I was in 2023 helping Trump win. And so, and, you know, asking for what they promised from us too. Like people say, you know, oh, Greta is not palatable anymore now that she's talking about the genocide in Gaza, which is true. But like she was like palatable when she was talking about climate change. I mean, they weren't even doing anything about climate change. And so it was, you know, it was absurd to me and I was getting frustrated. So my morale was low. And it took me a minute to get back up.
So, I mean, I want to sort of talk to you about, you know, your experience, just, you know, people that you've been organizing with and your own perspective, because, you know, the Biden administration, I mean, for somebody who had been like, you know, getting into organizing at that period of time, you know, there's that first couple of years where like we were calling the Biden administration the press release president, because Biden would put out these press releases that used a lot of like kind of activist language and things like that. And then there was a question of like, where is the action? And I could imagine how like, you know, the Biden administration could play a big role in maybe like disillusioning a lot of people with like how effective politics can be, in the same way Obama, you know, had been for a lot of us as well, where there's a lot of hope and excitement. I'm just curious about, you know, your perspective on how that might have, you know, shifted and affected people's perceptions about the effectiveness of politics and organizing.
Totally. And it's even more evident now that Trump won that like, he's doing so much as the president. And, you know, of course, a lot of things are getting blocked in the courts. It's, you know, move fast break things. But my hands are tied doesn't really bode well with me when we're facing climate breakdown, when your opposition is an explicitly Nazi organization at this point. And like I'm playing by the rules, playing by the process, it doesn't work with young people who are very desperate in action, and it doesn't really matter how. We want to see you fulfill your promises. And for me, also, the disillusionment, and a lot of young people's disillusionment also came last year when the Democratic Party was silent, when AIPAC ousted members of Congress that we do align with and have been receptive to young people like Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush. And seeing the Democratic Party let that happen, are complicit in that happening, it made me livid. Absolutely livid. I mean, there's a million reasons to showcase that the Democratic Party isn't listening to young people, but to not even support like a candidate being ousted by GOP backed like PACs, like it was I couldn't understand it. You know, it probably shouldn't have gotten to that point. I should have realized that a lot sooner, but you know, anyways, the disillusionment came there as well. Like, these are people trying to like have the Democratic Party concede to them from within, and they're being ousted. So is that really the strategy? Should that be our central strategy? Probably not. And we need to build external non-electoral power outside of Congress if we want to force concessions from the Democratic Party. It's not going to come from like one person primarying a corporate Democrat after another. You know, that's great, you know, to see, but it shouldn't be our central role. And I'm evolving tactics as a result of the Biden administration and the Democratic Party in general over the last 4 years.
Yeah, you know, and that's the thing is like, if I'm curious, like how you plan to put your energies during the Trump administration, like as you're sort of evolving, because I think clearly, like, one, there would probably be more, I guess, eyeballs on activism on certain issues if Kamala had won, because again, there's that contradiction between what the constituency wants and what the party doesn't. And Trump doesn't quite offer that as much, although he does make the stakes of what we're all fighting extremely stark. I'm curious how you're sort of thinking of the Trump administration from an activism standpoint.
Yeah, this is something I'm still working through, to be honest. I'm on my own role for how I navigated Trump administration. I'm struggling because I don't want to be a news page, and I don't want to just be reactive to every single thing that he does, to exhaust myself, to exhaust my audience, and also not provide tangible ways that they can take action when they see these horrible things happen. I don't feel like that's useful. And at the same time, we need to respond to these moments and use them to build power. And I'm just trying to strike a balance between that. I'm still figuring it out. And, I'm struggling with, okay, the NLRB is kind of non-existent. And what does it mean for labor power? We've done that before, like 90 years ago. What did that look like? I need to read some books. But I do think that tactics with leverage is how we defeat Trump. It's how we should have prioritized that under a Democratic majority. And I'm trying to lean more into labor power, tenant power, community power. And when you withhold your labor, when you withhold your rent, when you engage in tactics like the survival programs that the Black Panthers did, like, this is how you force concessions from powerful people, because you're withholding something that they need. I'm trying to use my page to show how in the South, people are still organizing despite the conditions that they're under, how tenants in Los Angeles are withholding their rent and winning. And how are they doing that? I'm trying to be more educational and proactive in this moment, because we needed more of that 10 years ago to have more institutional power on the left now to take on this moment. It's really sad that we're quite weak on the left when there's a fascist in power. But it's never too late to build it, and I'm trying to use my platform too.
Yeah, and I just on one note, you said you wanted to have this get some more from your access, and instead, basically, the Biden administration decided let's ban TikTok instead. But I do think it's very impressive the way you and some of the other Gen Z people have used TikTok. I mean, I'm not native to that platform. I did one Josh Hawley post about Jan 6 years ago, but. I think that is an extremely important thing to use in opposition, and I think it's even it's useful that you went through the journey that you had. It's like Lula in Brazil. Lula wasn't like a communist revolutionary. He was doing sort of basic welfare stuff, and they still tried to get him out of there with lawfare. And you guys helped Joe Biden win in 2000. And some of the payment, especially you mentioned from the liberals who said, why don't you blow all of your credibility with all the young people who follow you on TikTok by supporting an administration that's not delivering for you? Like, I think it's really important what you guys are like the role you play in having a voice that's authentic and organic, because that's not something $1 billion of campaign money can really buy.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, first of all. And I think what helps in that, despite the nonprofit industrial complex feeling that you need to water yourself down to appease powerful people, the thing about Gen Z for Change that is different, one, as executive director, I was very adamant that everything that we get is a general operating grant so that we decide what we spend money on exclusively. And if it's actually youth run, we can't have specific grants, and we actually have to dictate that. But beyond that, I think being a very front-facing organization that has 1.8 million followers on TikTok, that is growing on other platforms as well, that's full of creators with their own platforms, you have to be authentic in order to maintain trust with that audience. Your whole shtick is talking to that audience and, influencing them and teaching and educating them and giving them action items. You can only do that with trust, especially on TikTok. And we just simply couldn't water ourselves down and keep that audience. And I think we're more accountable to the people that we talk to, more than potentially one of those big nonprofit groups that, don't have as much of a connection. It's really just a mailing list that they have. And so, Gen Z for Change was I'm very proud that we were one of the organizations that was 10 toes down for Palestine immediately, and created campaigns and dedicated time and resources to calling for a weapons embargo more than a ceasefire and educating on our platform. And I believe that how we're structured is why.
Yeah, I think you guys have a lot to be proud of. Where should people follow you as you embark on this next leg of your journey?
I'm Elise Joshi on all platforms, TikTok, Twitter, I'm still on it. Well, I can't get off it yet, but and Instagram. Maybe I'll start a YouTube, but those are the trifecta for now.
There you go, Elise. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah,
today.
really.
Thank you guys for having me. Appreciate it. Talk to you later.
Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me as ever, David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, friend.
And joining us today, Van Jackson. Van is an international relations professor, also at the newsletter and podcast, the Undiplomatic podcast, undiplomatic.com. Van, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Long-time watcher, listener.
I'm a big fan of yours. There's a few episodes. I think the episode with a guy named Chris Schell I listened to of Undiplomatic maybe a year and a half ago, thinking like, oh, I think this might not go well for the Democrats writing some of these different foreign policy issues that they are trying to split the difference on. So really great. I can't recommend both the Substack and the YouTube page enough. Any more intro you want to give to folks for you, Van?
I mean, I'm an international relations scholar. I have a book that just came out with Mike Brennis called The Rivalry Peril. And then in addition to the Undiplomatic podcast on -diplomatic.com, I have the pleasure to co-host a podcast called Bang Bang, which is a show about war movies with an anti-imperialist twist. So my co-host and I are both anti-imperialists, but we're also both military veterans. So we have the kind of street cred to speak to that constituency, but with an anti-war message that, like, you know, take the profits out of war. The oligarchs are soaking you. Like, this is workers fighting against workers, et cetera, et cetera. But with cultural objects like Zero Dark 30 and Full Metal Jacket and that kind of thing. So, yeah,
very
that's
nice. Me. Here is the book here, just for folks, and that will be. So, Van, I mean, let's start with the military. Some of the Trump's cuts and firing of all sort of government employees that have sort of probationary status, which can include people who have just recently gotten promotions, appears to be extending to the Pentagon. What is your sort of assessment and reaction to this?
Yeah, I mean, well, what would it look like if, you know, white nationalists took over the national security state? That's basically what's happening right now, you know, on behalf of whom? On behalf of oligarchs, incidentally. And not really on behalf of white folks. That's kind of it, you know? So like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he gets fired because he's a black guy. I think of him as a warmonger. Like, he's an Uber hawk as far as I'm concerned. But on the military's own terms, based on their own expectations of what they want from a chairman of the Joint Chiefs, that's a little too perfect. But he gets fired because he happens to be a black guy, you know? And it's like that all the way down. The judge advocates general, the top lawyers of the military services, also gone. There's a staff of like over 1,000 people that were like me at one time. I served in the Obama administration's Pentagon. And like, there's civilians who are basically policy advisors. They go to like SAIS and Georgetown Graduate School, Kennedy School, and that kind of shit. And then they go in and they staff the secretary. It's this army of staff that make sure that the Secretary of Defense makes rational decisions towards the end of American primacy, which is like shouldn't be the goal, but like they're still rational within some boundaries. And that whole staff is being gutted. So like effectively what's happening is the reshaping of the military instrument so that militarized violence can be wielded without accountability. And the way that they're doing that is by lodging an attack against DEI and wokeness and climate change and shit. But that's mystification. Like, what's really going on is they don't want accountability for the tool of violence, you know?
Well, I mean, you know, when it comes to these cuts, it's been interesting sort of seeing the reaction and then seeing some of like the earlier details, right? Like, I mean, could you talk about like the scope of these? Because, you know, there's all these things that have been sort of picked out
that, oh, there'll be no cuts. Actually, there's going to be expansions, of those kind of budgets, right? Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about, the difference between hey, we're going to do something about the Pentagon budget, and then, here's the reality.
Dude, it's such a shell game. Yeah. So like the media, mainstream media is one of the reasons I started listening to Left Reckoning, frankly, was like mainstream media is just incompetent as hell. And they work for not normal people interests, which is part of like why they continue to be incompetent. And that matters in this case because like, once again, they were reporting incorrectly. So they were reporting based literally on like the good faith words of Trump administration people that like, oh, we're going to cut the budget because Trump has some fantasy of a 50% budget cut with Russia and China together. And like, but there's no actions following through on that. And so like what's really happening is like Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, announces this 8% cut to the budget. And then they're going to do that again and again, year on year on year. But the 8% cut is not a cut. It's a reallocation within national security spending. So they're going to find $50 billion or so, maybe, probably less than that. But then it's going to get reallocated toward other stuff. So paying off mercenaries to go raid Latin America. There's a $340 billion appropriation that the Senate just approved for Trump's regime of ICE immigration raids and deportations and all of that shit. And like that requires a giant army's worth of spending, And so that's being layered on top of what's already approximating $1 trillion defense budget. We're paying interest on all this stuff on the order of over $100 billion a year, like this is bananas. But that's what's happening.
So I'm curious, like, does the military have a desire to fight this? Because I remember the Joint Chiefs of Staff had a plant in the Nixon, spying on Richard Nixon, like in the 70s. And now Trump is just able to remove Joint Chiefs of Staff. Like, where is their capacity or desire to fight this, like as the deep state sort of hub?
Yeah, so in Trump 1.0, there was all that deep state resistance energy, and like Bill Maher types were sort of counting on unelected technocrats to save democracy, ironically. And fancy how that didn't work out, But basically, that energy has dissipated in a cloud of fear because that upper middle class professional cadre, which is very large, of civil servants, most of whom have very good intentions, like they've thought of themselves as basically like untouchable. The realities of American politics don't really affect them. They have if they end up being servants to the capitalist class, so what? They're focused on America's power position in the world, and they think they're drunk on American exceptionalism and all this stuff. Well, they're not in that insulated bubble anymore. They're vulnerable to attack just like other workers, right? And so like now they're the canary in the coal mine for everybody else, because it's like with what Eric Blanc, was talking about, you go after the federal workers and you succeed. Starbucks workers ain't got a chance. And so that's really tough. And that's the situation we're in right now. So like in that environment, federal workers who are used to serving, they're not used to civil disobedience. They have no political consciousness outside of like serving power, literally. Suddenly power's coming after them. So what are they going to do? I'm hoping that they can coordinate sick outs and withdraw their labor from the system. And like, the other dictatorships people have had to deal with these kinds of problems before, but we're just not used to it in technocratic class in America. So, but fear.
You mentioned you're a vet. I'm curious, it does seem like vets, one, they're placed in the civil service often, and also Trump's firings have hit a lot of them. Do you think there's going to be any sort of backlash to Trump on that front?
I sure hope so. I think it would have to get worse in order to really cause a sea change. Like a lot of military people, and frankly, a lot of national security bros, they can kind of like mollify themselves and just live with the system, whatever it's going to be, so long as they primarily exist to confront China. Like, as long as they can sort of focus on a foreign big bad, which in our horizon is China, then they can feel justified, because it's like, well, Trump is doing all these terrible things, but we're still confronting the great evil of our century or whatever, you know? So if they can find their place within American militarism, in essence, which is justified on the back of the China threat, then they're probably likely to just kind of go along and not resist too much. So like, as geopolitics is shifting, and if Trump does anything sort of big reversals on China or something, I think that would cause a revolt, frankly. But short of that, I don't know.
Interesting. Well, that might be a good opportunity to transition to Ukraine. I'm curious your take. Trump appears to be sort of going above Zelensky's head to talk with Russia. What's your sort of impression of those negotiations?
Well, I mean, Trump and Hegseth have both made very clear that, like, Ukraine is not going to get back basically the Donbass region. It's going to have to give up at least 20% of its territory. Ukraine will not be part of NATO, right? And on top of that, Trump wants to set up this extraction regime that loots, 50% of, Ukraine's critical minerals, the existence of which is overstated. But like, the minerals thing is like, it's evil, but these other positions are actually like realistic positions to expect on Ukraine. Like, of course, Ukraine shouldn't be in NATO. Like, what the fuck? Of course, a smaller power that's been invaded by a larger one that's winning the war is probably going to have to give up some territory as part of accommodating reality. The weird thing about it is to announce these kinds of accommodations like up front before negotiations even start, and to
That's
like
what the Democrats do.
Yeah. You said it. Yeah, that's pretty fucked up. Like, so that's what's super weird, right? And what it inevitably means is that Ukraine is going to be rendered into a colony within what's already like an American imperialist foreign policy. And like the frustration for somebody like me who spent his life like within the Democratic Party up to, recently is like, it didn't have to be this way. Putin is an imperialist, and you're not going to find me apologizing for him at all. But the reality has always been that like Biden came into office with like a neocon hardline on Russia. Putin had made his calculation at a certain point to be like, fuck you. And then once the war started, we could have pushed for a resolution within months. There's concept that the scholar I. Williams Artman had, mutual hurting stalemate. It's whenever a situation is negative sum. So it's like the longer time plays out, the more both sides are harmed. It's not like one side gets better with time or something. In a mutual hurting stalemate, that is the context when negotiated settlements to conflicts are most likely. And we reached that point in Ukraine, like literally within the first few months, right? The problem was that settlement would have required some territorial concessions. Washington's brilliant minds decided it was better to pretend like we're still in the unipolar moment. You got the Mike McFalls, we got this maximalism, and then the yada, yada, yada. Ukraine is forced to eat shit. Ukraine's people are forced to eat shit. It was very predictable that like, if we were going to support Ukraine, we needed to have like a shot clock on it, because the general election, the closer we got to it, the more likely it was Putin was just going to try to wait out Biden and hope for Trump. And that's like exactly what happened. And that's the worst of all possible worlds if you're a Ukraine head, Didn't have to be this way.
Well, I mean, on this, I definitely want to get back to this this extraction deal that Trump is negotiating, because it really is wild. But on this, like, understanding like this most recent history here, I mean, is the perspective here that like Biden and his team are just sort of unwilling to accept reality? Or was it like, purely ideological? Or was it like this kind of idea that, I remember Biden saying something along the lines of like, what are you talking about? We're doing bad in Ukraine. Like, we've degraded, like, look how many Russians have died. Like this idea, like, oh, they're going to weaken Russia, and basically use Ukraine as like a, as a sacrifice to weaken Russia for American power. I mean, what, as far as you can understand, can we say is like the logic here?
Yeah, it was kind of all of the above, right? Like, Biden's Secretary of Defense literally said at the outset of the war that like our metric of success is weakening Russia's military capacity, So we were trying to bleed them dry. And the Biden theory was the opposite of what I just said. The Biden theory was not to put a shot clock on it, but actually to like play this out as long as possible, in part because they thought their own shit didn't stink. Like, they thought that they could obviously win in 2024. Like, everybody thought it was a return to Aaron Sorkin's West Wing circa 2021, you know? And so that implicit belief in your own greatness really set you up for bad analysis and bad policy. And the ideological thing, I think there's something to that, because like the Biden administration, all these Bidenista guys, they were looking at Ukraine, the whole national security state pretty much looked at Ukraine as a chance for redemption for like the larger liberal hegemony project. This was a chance for American leadership to be restored. And what that does is literally it like displaces the people of Ukraine, and like they don't matter on their own terms. This is not about standing up to a bully. It's not about human solidarity. This is about redeeming the liberal internationalist project.
You know, I mean, on that, like talking about like Ukrainians, you know, you're somebody who comments on this stuff, writes on this stuff, is also on Twitter. You know, what do you have to say to some of these kind of like American liberals who act like folks like us who might have been advocating for an end to this war earlier? That, oh, you guys don't care about Ukraine. Oh, you want to sacrifice Ukraine. I mean, what would your response be to that kind of challenge from those folks?
I mean, it's pretty unserious. Like we're prioritizing, we're centering the Ukrainian people here. Like the reason for arguing for a settlement early on is out of a theory of least harm. The liberals who love Ukraine, and I think a lot of them do earnestly sort of have a fellow feeling for Ukraine as a country, they don't really see the Ukrainian people per se. It's the country, it's the abstraction that stands in for the people. And that's a huge problem, because it means that their priority and the liberals' priority, as well-intentioned as it is not to approach the situation with the principle of least harm in mind. And what we were all arguing on the left from the start is that least harm has to like define the goal, you know, like what is it that we have to do to make sure the least amount of people dies here and that least amount of people get exploited. And that is just not part of the calculation that they make, you know?
You know, I'm sorry, Matt, I just wanted like to focus so much on this Ukraine stuff, but like, I also wanted to ask just really quick about like where this leaves Europe, because I think this has been like a very, not just like in terms of, I mean, like one, like the American relationship with Europe now that Trump's back in power is like very strained. But I think there's also been a kind of a reality check for them as well, right? I mean, hell, just as like this past week, it's been kind of interesting seeing some of like the grandstanding that we've been getting from European powers, and then seeing them slowly start to back down on like Ukraine and, you know, providing troops, all this kind of stuff. I'm just curious, you know, your perspective on that with the recent events here.
Yeah, that's actually really like smart thing to observe, because it trend lines wise, it's like the big thing, you know, like Ukraine is a bit of a sideshow at this point, but like there's a larger strategic non-alignment happening, like, or the Europe is de-aligning from the US orbit. And this is, you could almost call this like non-alignment as in like Cold War non-aligned movement. And it's the bulk of Europe, but it's happening kind of like a decade later than it needed. Like we needed this energy back in the first Trump years, frankly. And it was obvious, like the writing's been on the wall that Trump is going to sort of abandon Europe in the traditional sense of like security reliance on the US. But like, yeah, now European diplomats are saying anonymously that America's the adversary, literally. You know, you have the incoming German chancellor, you have Spain. They're talking openly about like independence from the US. And there's some of that going on in like Asia and in the Pacific Islands too. So it's not just Europe. It's surprising to a lot of people because this whole Europe-NATO project seemed like ironclad. But yeah, that's a big, big, big shift, epochal. And it's going to end up forcing, if Europe is like remotely realistic in how it views the world, it's going to end up forcing a more realistic assessment of China, because the past 5 or 6 years, Europe has really gotten drunk on like the anti-China fetish, largely copying and pasting talking points from Washington. So like Australia does this too. Like there's this belief among elites that like if you ring the China threat bell enough, it will like rally America to your side, and Europe is going to have to rethink all of that now, because you can't have the two greatest powers in the international system both being adversarial to you, you know?
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating that, America voted with Russia and China abstained. Yeah.
Dude, up is down now, man.
How much, Trump, I welcome Bernie saying, look, we need to audit the Pentagon, this sort of stuff. But I also think like Trump's not trying to lower military spending globally. In fact, he's going around the world saying, y'all need to pick up the slack and start spending on weapons manufacturers. Is that venal? Is that for Americans' arms providers? Is that the China threat, or how do you assess that?
All of the above, yeah. Like Bernie kind of fucked up, I think. Like I'm obviously his guy, but he again, like the media, sort of seized on the prospect of mentioning defense cuts and was like, yeah, let's do it. But it's a reallocation within the overall defense budget. And so when you look at who the Trump administration is appointing in the Pentagon, when you look at who's in control of like House and Senate Armed Services committees, they're all plotting for $200 to $300 billion increases to the military budget above what we currently have, which is approaching $1 trillion. That's what they're in the process of doing right now. That's going to keep happening no matter what Trump says. And in fact, Hegseth has even clarified that like they're not going to end up cutting the top line necessarily. So this is just about doing the whole great power rivalry thing more efficiently. Like you still have to combat China and run an imperialist foreign policy. Like, how are you going to use the military as the foot soldiers of extractivism around the world? The two operating concepts I've heard from the national security state, and this is super grim. Minerals for military assistance as a worldwide paradigm, and Monroe Doctrine to the shores of China, which is a guaranteed World War III if you take that seriously. Like, that's not going to fly with anybody, So that's what we're setting up for right now. The cuts are not. There's tons of stuff that can be cut, and there's some foreshadowing of like what will be cut within the Pentagon, but it's not going to be to the top line. It's just going to be reallocations.
Yeah, and he's going around the world saying, y'all need to spend more too. You have a piece here that I think is very interesting that goes to like the ideological split here on undiplomatic.com. J.D. Vance versus Niall Ferguson is the stupidity we deserve. I've been a Niall Ferguson hater for over a decade now.
Oh, good.
But I'm just curious, can you outline this schism on the right regarding war?
Yeah, I mean, J.D. Vance, you might be surprised to find out he's the vice president of the United States because he spends a lot of time on Twitter. So
he's a vice poster.
Yeah. He called Neil Ferguson a globalist peddling moralistic garbage. And when he did that, it was Vance doing like rhetorical subterfuge to defend Trump's sort of weird negotiating posture on Ukraine, right? And like everybody in the commentariat, like left, right, and center, has been shitting all over this Trump's approach to Ukraine. Well, Neil Ferguson, for people who don't know, is like the Pete Hegseth of historians. So he's like kind of a joke, but with like a large public profile, and he's also the preeminent kind of anti-populist. So he supported every war in our lifetimes. He openly advocated for imperialism, literally, like capital I, during the War on Terror years. He's just a ruling class aristocrat. He's instinctively attracted to power. And his dilemma is that the Trump presidency that he wants to be close to also wants to end a war in Ukraine that he has cheered because he's got that neocon energy. And so, if you're a court historian, what are you supposed to do in that situation? So Vance comes at him with this criticism about like Neil Ferguson throwing shade at the Trump administration for their weird Ukraine strategy. And Vance goes back at him and critiques him with this moralistic garbage line. And so Ferguson responds by publicly flagellating himself, talking about how much he loves Trump and MAGA, and if Trump had won in 2020, Putin would have never invaded Russia and all this stuff. It's just like sycophant shit, like no self-respect, you know? And so that's the kind of, I mean, if this is what, I think he said in the newsletter, like if this is what passes for public debate, then we're screwed, you know? But it's like, you've got a neocon who wants to be close to power, and then you've got power doing this imperialist sphere of influence stuff in Ukraine, setting them up to be a colony. It's like, this is lose-lose, you know?
Do you buy the assessment that J.D. Vance won with the conservative base? And do you think that signifies any real anti-war sort of... I mean, I imagine there's some sincere anti-war feeling on the right. Like, what's your breakdown of that?
Yeah, there's a lot of anti-war energy, I think, everywhere in the working class, you know? The problem with the right, I've written about this too, like, they take that grievance where it's like war has just looted us, and then they redirect it toward Monroe Doctrine 2.0. You know? They're still allocating the $1.7 trillion for nuclear modernization over 30 years that the previous president did, and the one before that, all the way back to Obama, you know, like they're militarists. They're militarists and also imperialists, you know? I think the thing that a lot of people miss is like when they talk about stuff like multipolarity, they are happy with creating a world in which everyone kind of like abandons international institutions, abandons alliance arrangements, and starts spending like gangbusters on their own militaries. Because what that does is create a world of like ethnically homogenous nation states. They would love that. And then having your own national defense is part of that. And then in that world of just anarchy, America as the big dog can do imperialism or whatever the hell it wants unfettered. It can do primitive accumulation without the constraints of like obligation that had previously existed under like, you know, liberal hegemony or whatever. And so it's not like American foreign policy was bad before, but it's like at least there were some like nominal sort of checks on American overreach, and now that's all gone, you know. So not
right.
great.
Yeah, I mean, my assessment is that like all of these right wing, especially the influencers that, you know, might support the J.D. Vance over the Niall Ferguson, first, love to see it happen to Niall and Douglas Murray for that instance too. But I think all of those people will be full-throated in support of like America drone striking in Mexico in the next 4 years, without much of sort of even noting the contradiction.
Yeah, they think of like the war on terror as this straw man and the specific invasion of Iraq as this one-off anomaly thing. And any future wars, as long as we don't call them wars, it's all good, you know? So they have no problem with bombing this place or that place as long as we're not committed to like long-term counterinsurgencies and nation building. So they're fine with creating wreckage. They just don't want to have to rebuild anything.
Absolutely.
Well, before we let you go, Van, I have one last question. As a veteran and a pop culture expert and podcaster, you know, we all know that Trump likes his guys to be kind of made for TV, right? And Pete Hegseth, a big argument for him is that he looks like a commander. As somebody who is experienced and knows folks, you know, in the military has actual experience here, is Hegseth a made for TV character, or is he reflective of reality in terms of, you know, what figures in that position should look like?
A Secretary of Defense, I would much prefer an old enfeebled man to a guy who's like Christian nationalist tatted up, you know? Like, I don't want my Secretary of Defense doing burpees at 4 a.m. Made for TV. Yeah.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. It was really nice having you on the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's been a long time coming.
Yeah, thank
folks,
you.
go to un-diplomatic.com to check out the Substack and go log into YouTube, subscribe to YouTube. Van, thanks so much, man.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was really great. Great having Elise and Van on.
Yeah, good talking to them both.
Well, Y'all, we got a lot we're going to get to the post game. Patreon.com/leftreckoning. We're going to be talking a little bit about gold. We're also going to be talking about the Texas lottery, which, Matt, you haven't got the full story yet, but this scandal is something else.
Yeah, it sounds like there's child labor and stuff. It's cool.
there might be plenty of theater. So you all get access to that. Patreon.com/leftreckoning. We'll be up there in just a couple minutes. Also, if you're only getting these shows, you're missing literally 2/3 of what we put out. We put out the post game immediately after these, and then we got our Sunday shows, which I know y'all love them. We try to make as much as possible free and open to the public. But if you've been supporting us, enjoying the program, please consider subscribing. You get all those early. You get to listen to them, hang out with us. And also, if you can't subscribe, we never asked this, Matt, and we got to. Y'all got to go on the podcast apps. If you're listening, Apple Podcast, Spotify, and give us those ratings and reviews. We literally never ask folks to do it. Sometimes forget to mention that, yes, we do have all these episodes up as podcasts, but it really does help us out. So if you're not gonna subscribe to the Patreon, go and do that now. And if you already are a patron, why don't you help us out a little bit more by doing that?
Yeah, and if you're on Twitch or any of those, I guess Instagram, we need to start doing more Instagram stuff.
We sure do.
Talking to the Philly workers and Elise, not even having I can't remember which. Oh, not a YouTube channel. Like Instagram is where I think a lot of stuff is happening these days.
You're 100% right. But before we go, I just wanted to do one last thing, a quick shout out segment. This will just be a couple minutes, but talking about keeping your eye on the ball, and that's an important thing to do right now because there is a lot of really damaging and dangerous things happening. I mean, literally, we are watching an oligarch takeover of the United States government, right? But it is also really easy to kind of get lost in the moment. And I just want to do a quick shout out here to Congressman Greg Casar, who has really showed how to have your eye on the ball here. This is a story that we covered on this program earlier, a few months back. But at the Tesla Gigafactory, there was yet another death. And people who've been listening to this program for a while know we have talked about the extremely dangerous conditions at Elon Musk's many companies, but particularly the Gigafactory he has right here in Austin, Texas. We'd had Gus Bova on the program talking about, somebody who died building that factory, who literally said, "I'm afraid every day I go to work that I may die." Right? That's the kind of working conditions that this person has created and brought into the state of Texas. Very, very dangerous California ideals. But Greg Casar has really pushed on Musk and on OSHA and the federal government to make sure that there is a serious investigation into this most recent death here. And I just want to read a little bit from his follow-up here. He wrote a letter to the Deputy Assistant of the Department of Labor, saying the federal government should immediately release the result of its investigation into the workplace death of Victor Joe Gomez Sr. at the Tesla Gigafactory in my district. On the 1st of August, Mr. Gomez, an electrician, was working at the Tesla Gigafactory when he died after being electrocuted. OSHA opened an investigation into his death on that day. Any citation related to this case must have been issued by February 1st. However, OSHA's website still lists the case status as open on its online database. And he's not the only person to die. Antelmo Ramirez, who we talked about with Gus Bova of Texas Observer on this program, also died under very, very worrying conditions at the Tesla Gigafactory. Right, and it does matter. What this person is up to, Elon Musk. He has been trying to get influence over the government. That's what he's trying to do in Travis County and in the state of Texas, so that he can be able to get away with running his little fiefdoms however he wants, and with no regard to the safety and the security of the people whose labor is actually responsible for all of his wealth. So I appreciate Greg Casar continuing to make sure that this doesn't get lost in the news, because this is important, that the richest person in the world, who is now in the government, very likely is going to try to be doing many things to make sure that he isn't held accountable for his activities, is held accountable.
Yeah, and it's just the joke about him saying, well, if there's a conflict of interest, I'll recuse myself. It's everything. This OSHA, any measures they take on OSHA, whether it's NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, because his Tesla in full self-driving mode just ran over a woman on an off-ramp because there was an accident that it came across too fast. That was a pending investigation. Whether it's his satellites, because he is a military contractor, his spy satellites, internet satellites falling out of the sky, causing flights to be turned around in Tennessee. That's just like becoming a background noise now. And yeah, it's like less of a power grab and more of just like it's like just it's like if it's like playing without referees or something. Like if you're like the strongest player, you just run through people and there's no referees to say anything about it. Just run through your workers. They get electrocuted. Who cares? Cost of doing business.
100%. And those systems need, like organizations like OSHA. I mean, hell, protect them, I guess, from cuts, but like those things need to have some teeth because the fact that these have just been kind of cost of doing business to maybe get a little fine here and there is ridiculous in a country like America.
And that's that's great of Kassar to sort of remind people, and maybe for the first time, what actually needs to be done in this regard. And it can't, like you said, just be like go back to the status quo. These things are here for a reason. It's time to actually put them toward that reason.
100%. Well, folks, thank you all so much for hanging out with us. We're going to go over the post game again, patreon.com/leftreckoning to get access. Come join. We're going to talk about Texas lottery, take your questions, talk a little bit about what happened to gold in Fort Knox, many other big questions over there. So come and hang out with us, friends.